Hello one and all, it is the Comics Kid 2099 here for another review. Once again, I am reviewing a book from DC's New 52 relaunch that began in late 2011. The first book from this relaunch I reviewed was the first 8 issues of Grant Morrison's Action Comics, collected in Action Comics, Superman and the Men of Steel. I encourage you to go watch that video before watching this one, as I will no doubt talk about the contents of that book while I'm talking about this book. Here I am going to be reviewing Superman, For What Price Tomorrow. Now that you've hopefully scanned the previous video that I mentioned, you already know that I didn't much care for what I saw of Grant Morrison's Action Comics. I felt like it started out fairly strong, and then it quickly devolved into some kind of drivel. Comparing George Perez's adjectiveless Superman to Morrison's Action Comics, I don't feel like it starts off nearly as strong, but at the same time, it doesn't drop nearly as far either. This book isn't as spectacular as Morrison's book was at its very, very best, and it fortunately isn't as bloody awful as Morrison's Action was at its absolute worst. It's just kinda somewhere in the middle. Hopefully, by the time I'm done with this review, I'll have a better idea of where I stand on this book, and then maybe you will have a better idea of whether you should get it or not, if that's why you're watching this video. One thing I appreciated about this book was the tone. I haven't really discussed tone very much in any of my reviews, because I've never really felt like I had to. But one complaint I have heard from quite a few different people is that they're not a fan of the cynical, hopeless direction the DC Universe has taken since the relaunch began. Characters who used to inspire readers to act like better human beings now act like scumbags, according to detractors of this relaunch. And I'm not here to debunk or confirm this accusation, since I have not read very much of the New 52. In Action Comics by Grant Morrison, I'd certainly say there is a little bit of that there at the beginning, but the protagonist quickly becomes a less reprehensible character, even if I didn't appreciate the execution of this transition. And it could be that I was sort of expecting this book to be throwing the mean, extreme 1990s anti-hero archetype at me, so I was floored by a character that actually feels quite a bit like the real Superman. Now don't get me wrong. This Superman isn't exactly the one we had before the reboot, or at least not the one I'm used to reading about. I feel like the Superman from before the relaunch has this aura about him that makes him seem like you can instantly trust him, and anyone surrounding him just seems to cede the floor to him regardless of the situation. The Superman I am more familiar with is the kind of guy who you would think you would be very nervous around, but you'd feel right at home eating lunch with him or playing catch with a football or something like that. The Superman featured in Superman What Price Tomorrow, he isn't as bloodthirsty and as psychotic as the detractors of the New 52 would have you believe, but he's not quite as warm and genial as the pre-relaunch Superman. There is an aspect of loneliness about this guy. It makes sense that Superman would act like this when he is growing up, like in Smallville, or when he's first started fighting crime, like in Morrison's Action Comics. But as this book points out, this guy has been fighting crime for 5 years. I would think by this point that Superman would feel more confident about himself, which would lead to that Superman that you'd love to chat with for several hours. The one that I don't feel like this book is about. And I don't think this reinterpretation of Superman is accidental. Several times in this book, Lois Lane and Perry White both talk about how Clark has been acting oddly for the last few weeks. At first, these characters, and the audience as well, they attribute it to the Daily Planet being purchased by Galaxy Broadcasting, which is a move that Clark very firmly disagrees with. As it turns out, Clark is actually being mind-controlled by the villain of this book. At least, that's what I think is happening. The villain of this story is a microscopic machine that was carried from Superman's armor to Earth when Superman first put on the armor during the events of Grant Morrison's Action Comics Volume 1. And somehow, this microscopic machine is able to simulate certain conditions, like fire, invisibility, and icy weather. This ability is only scarcely explained, unfortunately. In any case, somehow, this machine is also able to take control of someone's mind, and apparently, for certain parts of this book, they took control of Superman's mind. At one point, he was in Smallville, visiting the grave of his parents. Later, he thinks that he didn't even remember being in Smallville until Lois confronted him about it. So if the machines forced Clark to go to Smallville and then he didn't remember going there, why would the machines want him there? These things aren't really explained, and I doubt they ever will be, since George Perez left this title after issue 6. In any case, it seems to be hinted that Superman isn't acting like himself because the machines are taking control of his mind at certain times. We're never certain when Superman is actually himself and when he isn't, but it seems to me that doing a story where the main character isn't acting like himself is not the kind of story that you want to do for a relaunch when you are introducing your character to the audience. Even people who are very familiar with comics are still going to be introduced to this character for the first time, in a sense. Those of us who are familiar with Superman can't be certain that this character is the Superman we are familiar with, and in fact, he isn't. It just seems to me that this kind of story is something you would want to do 3 or 4 years after the relaunch has begun. By that point, all of your readers, new and old, have had time to get to know your main character, and they know what he is supposed to act like, so that when he isn't acting like that, we know why it's such a big deal. In my review of the first volume of Morrison's Action Comics, I wasn't sure why the owner of Galaxy Broadcasting was a Glenn Morgan, when the character seems so similar to Morgan Edge, who has traditionally been the owner of Galaxy Broadcasting. Here I get my answer, although I also get more unanswered questions. Morgan Edge is apparently the owner of Galaxy Broadcasting 5 years after the events of Grant Morrison's Action Comics run. And the characters even mention the similarities and differences of Glenn Morgan and Morgan Edge. So clearly, I wasn't the only one who thought Glenn Morgan was Morgan Edge-ish. I know that George Perez complained that when he was working on this title, the editorial bosses continually asked for changes to his stories to accommodate what Grant Morrison was doing in Action Comics. It seems strange, then, that George Perez was the one who ended up with a character of Morgan Edge, an actual established Superman supporting character, and sometime antagonist, while Morrison ends up with what seems like a cheap knockoff to Morgan Edge. I would have thought, if Perez was the one getting the short end of the stick on the Superman books, that he would have been the one to end up with the cheap knockoff. One element that I really liked about this book was the new hierarchy of the staff of the Daily Planet. In Galaxy Broadcasting purchasing the Daily Planet and all of the members of the Daily Planet becoming employees of Morgan Edge, Lois Lane became in charge of the television news portions of Galaxy, while Perry White remained in charge of the newspaper portion of Galaxy. I feel like it would have been an interesting situation to explore if Lois Lane was now Clark's boss. They have always been partners on equal footing in every version of the Superman story, so putting Lois in charge of Clark would have been something that I really would have liked to see be explored more. But, as near as I can tell, Lois and Clark aren't even working in the same department of Galaxy Broadcasting anymore. At least, that's how I interpreted this new positioning of the staff of the Daily Planet. Maybe I just wasn't paying enough attention, but I sometimes felt very confused about who was working for what part of the company. In a story where I'm not usually familiar with the establishment the story is set in, it is important that the story make clear what is happening in the establishment while not allowing the story to take a back seat so that exposition can happen. An excellent example of this in action is the television series Scrubs. I never once felt confused about the hierarchy of the Hospital of Sacred Heart, or the position that each character in the show played. It was all made very clear in subtle ways so that the story could still happen. I think this book should have taken a cue from Scrubs, as there were many times when I wasn't sure if Perry was still Lois's boss or just a friend who works in the same building. I wasn't sure if Jimmy and Clark were co-workers anymore, or if Jimmy was working for the television portion of the studios, while Clark still worked for the newspaper portion. None of this is made especially clear, and while the story doesn't necessarily take a turn into the horrible because of this, I do feel like it could have been made much more clear. The only other thing I really wanted to talk about in this book was the pacing. For the first 3 issues of this book, I feel like nothing important is really happening at all. In the first issue, a fire monster attacks. It speaks Kryptonian, and then it disappears. In issue 2, an invisible crocodile attacks. It speaks Kryptonian, and then it disappears. In issue 3, an ice monster attacks. It speaks Kryptonian, and it disappears. I understand that there are elements of the story that have to be set up over the span of a few issues in the form of subplots, but the main plot shouldn't be so transparently boring and the same thing for 3 issues in a row. This is half of the book where I don't feel like anything important is happening, and then in the last half of the book, finally things start happening. This might not have been a problem if someone only jumped onto the book in issue 3, and it might not have even been a very noticeable problem if you were reading these issues as they came out, with 1 month separating each issue's release. But it is very much a problem when you are reading it all in the span of a couple of days. Honestly, for my final verdict on this book, I maintain that it doesn't ever feel as strong as Morrison's Action Comics did at its best, but it is also never as blood-curdlingly bad as Action Comics was at its worst. Superman, For What Price Tomorrow, isn't going to change anyone's perception of superhero comics, I don't think, but sometimes a book doesn't have to do that. This book is consistent in what it does, which is, for the most part, delivering a decently solid superhero story. As someone who is always trying to find a great jumping-on point of Superman comics, I'm not entirely sure if this is the best place to start, especially since George Perez left the book after the conclusion of this arc. But I do think if Perez had stayed on the book, I would have stuck with his Superman series just to see where he took things. That's my verdict on Superman, For What Price Tomorrow. I hope this review was helpful to you guys, and if you liked what you heard here, then please feel free to subscribe for more reviews similar to this one. Until then, I'll see you guys next time with some other kind of video.